Owen, thanks for chatting with me today.
Good, thanks for having me.
So we might just start off by talking about Sinn Féin and populism, because most people, or a lot of people listening into this podcast, will be coming from various other European countries who may not be so familiar with the kind of Sinn Féin party, with the kind of nationalist tradition in Ireland. So is Sinn Féin a populist party?
So the straight answer is it depends on what you mean by populism. And there's a very lively, very interesting, but unfortunately sometimes very misinformed debate, both in academic and in journalistic circles around Europe, around this term, right? So you on the one hand have this media debate that has a very pejorative use of the term populism, which essentially suggests politicians who just say things to get votes, just to be popular. Obviously, there's another body of literature, journalistic and academic, which is looking at the rise of authoritarian, populist, right-wing political parties in governments, whether it's Orban in Hungary or Salvini in Italy or elsewhere, and obviously Trump in the US. And then there's another group of debates which are around, is it possible to construct a progressive, pluralist, left populism, whether it's on the basis of Syriza, or Podemos or Bernie Sanders, for example, or Corbyn. So if you're asking me, is Sinn Féin part of that third set of discussions, the answer is yes. And I suppose that then means, what do we mean by the term populism? And as all of the kind of sympathetic commentators who are having this discussion will say, is populism isn't an ideology in the sense of socialism or liberalism. Populism is a political strategy. It's a discursive strategy. It's a way of doing politics that tries to bring together what are disparate concerns in a population where people feel they're left behind by the status quo for economic or social or cultural reasons, and to coalesce those divergent interests and concerns into a single political subject, the people, in opposition to centres of power, whether they're political or economic elites. So what I suppose the advocates of that progressive left populism will say is, unlike the authoritarian right-wing populism that tries to articulate a sense of the people in opposition, on the one hand, to political and economic elites, but on the other hand, to other outgroups like migrants and, for example, the lesbian and gay community, etc. Left populism is trying to articulate a plural, progressive, democratic project, which is left in its socioeconomic content. In many instances, it's nationalist in a progressive way, because it's set within the context of the nation state, and the nation state progressively pulling against the neoliberal European architecture. But at the same time, it's employing that populist strategy of trying to articulate a movement of the people against the minority centre interests of power as a mechanism for building a kind of hegemonic political project and ultimately taking state power. So I suppose the short answer to that long-winded ramble is yes, but only in the context of that third kind of debate that's ongoing within political and academic circles.
I mean, I have kind of contested views on this myself in whether or not populism is a useful concept to capture what are clearly qualitatively very different politics. So, I mean, it seems to me that if we try to squeeze in the Trump, Orban, Salvini, Sinn Féin, Podemos into one kind of concept, you really risk stretching it to become rather meaningless. So is there something, so you're saying that there is something qualitatively distinctive about a left populism which really has nothing in common with those other variants of kind of right-wing, or what has become in popular commentary the reference point for populism, which is right-wing nationalist movements?
What I'm saying is slightly different, right? What I'm saying is that populism is a political, organizational, discursive strategy. And strategy can be used for good things and bad things in politics, in business, in life. And there are very clearly two types of populism that are operating in political spaces, particularly in the US and Europe at the moment. And they are very different. That doesn't mean they're not employing similar strategies, although there are differences in the strategies as well. So I suppose what allows you to associate, for example, Sinn Féin, Corbyn's Labour project, Sanders' attempt for the Democratic presidential candidacy, Podemos, but also, for example, progressive Catalan nationalism and its recent attempt to secure a referendum, our friends in Sortu and Bildu in the Basque Country. is that they are articulating a political project which is trying to construct a political subject that is the people, and the people being very diverse with different interests and needs, in opposition to a minority political and economic elite, political and economic status quo. I suppose that the big divergence between that project, and there are differences between those different groups I just mentioned, notwithstanding, the big difference between that and the Orban, Farage, Johnson, Trump project is, on the one hand, that other project is authoritarian, so it's not interested in deepening the operation of democracy and democratic institutions in the way left populism is. It is not only focused against centres of social and economic power at the top of the hierarchies of our society, but also punching down against those at the very bottom of our society, migrants, lesbian and gay communities, and other marginalised groups. And ultimately, I suppose there's a fundamental difference, which is if what is inspiring, motivating, facilitating these two types of populism is the favour of liberalism, and that's something we'll get on to. Yeah. What left populism is trying to do is deepen the progressive traditions of liberalism into creating a much more democratic and more radically democratic political space. What right-wing populism is trying to do, of course, is close off the space of liberalism at all and throw the baby out with the bathwater, and we lose those progressive political traditions of liberalism from the 18th and 19th century in the creation of a much more authoritarian and right-wing regime. So those two types of projects are fundamentally different.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean they don't employ, for example, certain types of strategic maneuvers which have a comparison, but that's the same. Like, democracy is a contested concept, socialism is a contested concept, liberalism and neoliberalism are contested.
Yeah.
And not only are they contested, they evolve and change. So I think the really important point is not to have a kind of a 19th century Victorian attitude where you're trying to, pin all the different butterflies from a different species onto one table, but understand these are ways of doing things and they evolve and change, but they're still terms and categories and comparisons that have some utility in understanding what's going on.
Many people would argue, for example, that the failure of Corbyn or Sanders, and to a certain extent maybe Podemos and other, let's say, left populist movements in the kind of advanced capitalist democracy of the world, failed because they didn't have a nationalist story to tell, or failed because they didn't have some sort of discursive strategy, if you want to be consistent with the terminology here in terms of populism as a strategy, that had something to say about the flag, right? Does that make Sinn Féin unique because you are a nationalist party? You have, you wave the flag with pride, whereas other left populist party would probably struggle to do that. They would struggle to mobilize traditional working class constituencies because maybe they don't have a nationalist story to tell.
Yeah, so I mean, if you broaden the discussion out and you look at where populism historically has been strongest, which is in Latin America, both in terms of centre-right populism of the Perón regime in Argentina, but also the more progressive populisms of the early Chavez regime or the Morales regime, etc., or even what's happening in Mexico at the minute, is that what those successful left populist projects have done, if they have combined a kind of a radical social democratic project in terms of economic policy with a populist political strategy in terms of articulating a sense of the people, but they've wrapped it up in a very progressive, or attempted to wrap it up in a progressive sense of national identity and culture. I think that's also been the case, for example, in Greece, both with PASOK previously, who were kind of an interesting, a slightly more left-wing version of Fianna Fáil, you could say, but very clearly both a progressive nationalist and quasi-social democratic party, and Syriza then took up that mantle afterwards. And again, I suppose one of the things that frustrates me about some of the literature about the current wave of populism and left populism is it only looks at Spain, at Britain and the US, which of course are the least successful of those projects to date, albeit very interesting. And they're ignoring, for example, the Basque Country, Catalonia, Ireland. They're also kind of ignoring Greece since the collapse of the kind of Syriza project, when they succumbed to the diktats of the European Council and Commission a number of years ago. So I think if we want to fully understand both the potential in the utilization of a progressive populist political strategy as part of a broader, what I would call left Republican project in Ireland, people have different terms elsewhere, I think we need to look in the round at those other instances of progressive populism, But we also need to look at them more critically. Like, one of the things that frustrates me about some of the commentary, although your student recently published a book on left populism in the US and Spain, and his is quite interesting because unlike some of the early texts around Syriza, for example, where they wanted to celebrate what they thought was really interesting, once things started to go bad in Greece, all of the progressive intellectuals and left commentariat just walked away and weren't interested anymore. Whereas the really important lessons to be learned, both in Spain, in Greece, in the US, and indeed in Britain, are the moment of failure, not the moment of ascension. And I do think those of us who are interested in this because we have skin in the game, because we're actively involved in trying to build those projects, we need to take a much harsher and more critical look at what's going on in all of those instances to see what worked, what didn't work. And it's not just about the failure of some of these left populist political projects to acquire state power or to acquire majority state power. It's also about what happens when they are in institutional or positions of institutional power, what goes wrong. And for me, Greece is the really important one there. And the old kind of traditional leftist tropes of sellouts, of treachery, they don't explain what happens in those very specific socioeconomic and political conjectures. And that's why we need to kind of look at those things more thoroughly. Because I think what your student Jorge's book really does demonstrate is populism isn't a flash in the pan thing. It's here to stay for quite some time. And I think the more recent rise of Sinn Féin and the consolidation of our strength, particularly in the 26 counties in terms of opinion polls, shows that this moment isn't over yet. And I suppose what I'm interested in is not making the same mistakes that Syriza have made or Podemos has made or Sanders or Corbyn, so that our project is more successful both in acquiring state power, but also utilising state power in a much more progressive left Republican manner.
But so if populism is a strategy and it's aimed at mobilising a diverse, plural constituency and peoples, and we could perhaps tease that out in the Irish case, because it seems to me that the Irish voter has changed dramatically, and a lot of the commentariat and a lot of, quite frankly, Irish political science hasn't quite caught up with that reality. Maybe because they themselves are a slightly older demographic. But does populism as a strategy come to an end when populist parties enter government? Because when you're entering government, you have to deal with the constraints of governance, and the constraints of governance and managing a very, very complex market economy and all the political trade-offs and economic trade-offs that come with that. It makes it very difficult to satisfy everybody all the time, which is arguably what is central to a populist strategy in terms of mobilizing people. So is it successful in government, or do we just don't know?
So again, I suppose, well, the context is very, very different. If you go back to the Latin American example, it proved very successful insofar as it allowed a number of diverse political movements, at various stages in the 20th and early 21st century to acquire state power and to stay in positions of government for quite long periods of time. And that's both the centre-right populisms and the left populisms that we've mentioned. Now, there's an open debate, of course, about how successful those political parties were in terms of economic governance, in terms of democratic legitimacy, in terms of those things. But where there are failures, and I think you can very clearly identify failures, they're not because of the utilisation of populism as a political strategy. They're to do with the failures of economic policy or political practice, or etc. And again, that's why I think learning from those failures is absolutely key. For example, the Western European left was the greatest cheerleader of Chavez when everything was going well. But when things started going bad, people just stopped talking about Chavez apart from the political parties of the right. Whereas again, for somebody like me who wants to be part of a progressive left Republican government that does things profoundly differently in social economic policy from what we've seen from Irish governments over the last century, I want to learn from the mistakes of those periods as well. Again, Mexico is probably a more important example for many of us because unlike Venezuela, for example, where there was 80% of the population living below the poverty line when Chavez first took power, what's happening with the new left government there is it is obviously a different kind of society to Ireland in social and economic and political terms, but it's also a society that has a much more sizable middle class and more stable institutions of democracy. Again, lots and lots of differences as well in terms of the role of cartel drug gangs and political corruption and all of that kind of stuff. But I do think there needs to be a much more honest appraisal, for example, of Greece. I do also think there needs to be a proper assessment of Portugal because we're talking about all of these things, and Portugal points to a different strategy where you have a much more traditional social democratic party that has revived the social democratic space built alliances with parties who were initially more associated with the kind of left populist Euro periphery movements, particularly the Bloco in Portugal. And while the available information in the English language limits the ability of some of us to fully understand what's going on there, certainly has produced a level of success in certain areas. Housing policy is very interesting at a mayoral level and a central government level. Some counter-cyclical policies, some reversals of some of the harshest ends of austerity. So we shouldn't just limit ourselves. It's a little bit like when we were looking at the pink tide in Latin America, and the left in Europe kind of oddly divided into those people who were in favour of Lula and the Workers' Party in Brazil, or Chavez and the populist movement in Venezuela, where I think there's merits and lessons to be learned from both, and you need to be learning those, and I think it's the same at the moment. So I'd like to see a much fuller debate in Ireland among the progressive parties around what's happening and what has happened among left parties who are in or trying to acquire state power, and what they have done with it. And for me, these are all tools. It's like doing anything. A tool is only as good as how you use it. Yeah. And while one group of people may have used one group of tools historically, and another group may have used another group, if both tools are useful to us now in the much more substantive project, which is that left Republican project, which is the really big part of what we're trying to achieve, then let's utilize every tool available to us, so long as it doesn't compromise our core political policy principles in terms of what we're trying to do island-wide, in terms of Irish reunification, but also in terms of socioeconomic advancement for working people north and south.
But so you clearly have a vision, right, for how you imagine Sinn Féin and where you identify Sinn Féin and this kind of left populist turn, if you like, in various different countries. Is that shared widely within Sinn Féin? Is that something that all of the leadership of Sinn Féin, is that something that the party shares? Or are there different coalitions within the party? I mean, it is a party operating in two different political jurisdictions, for example. So is this something that's widely shared, or is this your kind of intellectual vision for Sinn Féin?
Well, first of all, the political project of the party, and it's the political project the party agreed by party members at the Ardèche and implemented by party activists in political institutions and the party leadership, is a left Republican project. So that is agreed. And that is a project that is trying to combine, on the one hand, advances towards Irish reunification through the institutions and the mechanisms provided by the Belfast Agreement, while at the same time trying to implement a radical left of centre social democratic programme. And you can call it, democratic socialist or social democratic, but it's about trying to expand the role of the state to universalise the provision of key public services beyond just a safety net, but into that idea of kind of widespread social capital, and through doing so, dramatically reduce not only inequalities, but the unequal distribution of power and resources across all sections of society. So it's not social democracy as we had in the 80s and 90s, which is just softening the harsh edges of capitalism, but it's about a much more transformatory project. Okay. Look, you can have that nice rhetoric, and in the world of political theory and in the world of essay writing and article writing that you and I both do, that stuff has cleaner edges. Yeah. In the world of political competition, contestation, those things become much more tricky. And whether at the local government level, central government level, intergovernmental level, or the European level, how you negotiate advances and kind of defensive maneuvers isn't straightforward. It's not without difficulty. So I think all of that's agreed. I think if you were to ask, 25 Sinn Féin representatives, are you populist or not, their answer would depend on what they understood. So, for example, some of our people, their understanding of populism is the pejorative terminology that I described at the start. And clearly we're not that. So some of our people would say, oh no, we're not, because that's Fianna Fáil at its worst, or that's Boris Johnson at his worst. There would be some people who are connected to these broader academic debates or political theoretical debates that will say yes, but caveated in the way I'm doing. But that doesn't matter. What matters is what's actually being done, right? So for example, when Mary Lou MacDonald or Gerry Adams rail against the elites, which we do regularly and rightfully do, that's a populist strategic manoeuvre. That's an attempt to draw a clear line in the political space between the people, plurally constituted as people with different sets of socioeconomic interests, and that minority at the top. And look at what Pierce Doherty, in the language he's used, in his attempt to seek progressive reform of the insurance industry or the mortgage industry. Look at what I do when I'm talking about, for example, big institutional investors and developers and co-living and build to rent. Look at what Mary Lou is doing in terms of her response to Govt.
Yeah.
There's a discourse that connects all of those diverse instances of political and economic struggle, which utilizes the language of the people versus the elite. And that is because we are trying to bring into being a political subject. Like, you know, again, this is where you get into the realm of political theory, which might alienate some activists in the political process, but political subjects don't exist naturally. Right?
Yes.
Political subjects are brought into being by trade unions, community organizations, political parties, mass movements. And what a populist political strategy does is say, there's people over here hammered on the mortgages, people over there who can't get access to accommodation, people over here who live in border communities who are really negatively affected by partition, people in Belfast who want to be able to live their life through the Irish language, but have been impeded by the failure of the unionists to implement the Knock na Gaeilge, etc., etc., etc. How do we bring all of those people together, respecting their divergent interests and needs, but mobilizing them as a single political subject? Yeah. And that's what populism tries to do. And again, crucially, ours is that diverse, pluralist subject, because it also includes asylum seekers, it also includes transgender people, it also includes people who are securing further advances in lesbian, gay, equality, etc. And therefore, you're trying to build that maximum coalition. Is it always contingent? Is it always fluid and flexible? When you get into institutional positions of institutional power, can you satisfy all of those needs all of the time? Of course not. That's the nature of politics. But any government has that. Like, if you're not employing a populist strategy, if you're employing a technocratic kind of neoliberal strategy, as Finn Féin and Fine Gael have done for decades, you still get elected by a majority of people. And those people still have divergent needs and interests, which you have to try and satisfy in government. I suppose the big difference is, and this is one of the reasons why we're now in this space with the technocratic cosmopolitan liberals on one side and the progressive populist left on the other side, as we're trying to constitute it, is because of the failure of that technocratic liberal project domestically and at a European level to satisfy those needs. In fact, the very opposite, it's undermined many of those. And that has opened up a space, on the one hand, for some of the really negative reactionary authoritarian populism, but also for this other option, which ourselves or Corbyn or Podemos or Syriza or Sortu or the Catalan independence movement are trying to articulate. And this hasn't been decided. If your question is, are you successful or not, we have to wait and see.
Sure, but the 2020 election is interesting. It seems to me, and I've been doing some kind of empirical work on this, looking at the 2020 Irish election survey, and then contextualizing it within the other waves. There's clearly been a structural shift in Irish politics from 2008 onwards. And there's clearly been a kind of pattern of change happening. Now, whether the question that I find interesting is, on the one hand, maybe public opinion and voter behavior itself is changing, because it's fairly obvious now, and it's showing itself up in the data. The average Irish voter now identifies on the left, the centre left, when it comes to redistributive policies and when it comes to socio-cultural issues. So on the one hand, that's there on the demand side, right? Now, arguably, what has changed is not so much the voter, but perhaps on the supply side, a party has come along and, as you say, tried to mobilize and articulate a political subject. And that party, it seems to me, looking at it objectively, is Sinn Féin. I know a lot of the Irish commentary that really struggle with that shift, but it seems to me that there is a clear left-right divide in Irish politics now, with Sinn Féin being the biggest party on the left and Fine Gael arguably going forward being the biggest party on the right. So you have that polarization, which can be good and bad depending on how it plays out. But as you say, we don't know. Let's see. But it seems to me, and if you look at this comparatively, Sinn Féin's core anchor, if you like, is traditional working class, which arguably they have taken from Fianna Fáil. In other European countries, that vote would have been traditionally to the centre-left or the Social Democrats. And it's the radical right, it's the nationalist right that are taking that vote. So therefore, Sinn Féin is I would not argue, and I know that some people think that Sinn Féin are a right-wing party. I don't consider that to be the case. But is it the case that because Sinn Féin are anchored, arguably, in a traditional working class base, but are branching out beyond that and building a diverse coalition with urban graduates who are concerned about housing, by putting the weight on economic issues in your mobilizing strategy, you're blocking off the possibility of a more cultural nationalist narrative, Or is it the case that it's only a matter of time before somebody comes along and begins to mobilize on anti-immigration, anti-LGBT rights and a classic Catholic conservative nationalism? Is that threat there, or does Sinn Féin block that off?
Well, I look at it in a slightly different way, right? So if you go back to the high point of the Eurozone crisis, one of the really interesting distinctions was working class communities and lower middle class communities who were particularly negatively affected by the Eurozone crisis and on austerity. In the Eurozone periphery, gravitated towards the radical left or left Republicans or whatever you want to call us. And in the Eurozone core, gravitated towards the authoritarian populist right. And I think there's a very simple reason for that. And it's to do with the fact that in Ireland, in Greece, in Portugal, and in Spain, there was no difficulty for the left parties that emerged stronger at those moments articulating their project in conjunction with progressive nationalism. I mean, the big turning point for Podemos, for example, was its embrace of that idea of patriotism and trying to wrestle patriotism away from the Popular Party in Spain and articulate a progressive version. If you look at Catalonia, for example, and if you look at the Basque Country, that has been a process in train for 10 years before. And likewise with the rest of the Eurozone periphery. So I think the reason why you haven't seen, and the battle between Golden Dawn and Syriza is an interesting case in point, because there you had a country on the southern tip of Europe facing all of the huge pressures as a result of the very significant levels of immigrant migration caused by the wars in the Middle and Near East. You had an organized, clearly fascist movement. But Syriza were able to do battle with those parties in core working class and coastal communities and win that battle decisively. And the reason why is because in Greece, in Portugal, in Italy, in Spain, and in Ireland, there was a strong tradition of integrating a left and socioeconomic programme with a variety of forms of progressive culture and nationalism. The left Republican tradition in Ireland is that and elsewhere. The big difficulty in the continent, and Italy is a case in point, and probably the worst case in point, but France and Germany and others, and Britain suffers from this too, is that the terrain of cultural nationalism was just abandoned to the right. And we saw this early, for example, in Britain, in inner cities, for example, in London, where you had the rise of the BNP in the very early 90s, because working class labourism had just evaporated. It had been replaced by kind of neoliberal pre-Blairite and Blairite politics. And the only people in there talking about the kind of issues in a language that made sense to working class communities in Bermondsey or other places was the National Front and the BNP. So for me, the lesson of that is that left projects should never abandon the debate around the nation, should never abandon the debate around cultural identity. What they should do is they should contest it. And again, I think if you look at Sinn Féin, for example, the really interesting thing is we are absolutely a cultural nationalist and a politically nationalist party. Yeah. But you look at key moments, for example, like the citizenship referendum or the appalling treatment of Bulgarians and Romanians when those countries first entered the member state, Sinn Féin took the progressive side in terms of either defending the rights of Bulgarians and Romanians to free movement within the European Union, something Fine didn't do, or opposing the citizenship referendum because we believe everybody who's born on the island of Ireland has a right to Irish citizenship. So, I lived in London for a long time, and the big problem for the British left, and for the English left in particular, Scotland didn't really have this problem, was nationalism became a dirty word. It became something of the right, and notwithstanding the attempt of some left intellectuals to articulate, or some left cultural figures like Billy Bragg, to try and recapture that. And I think you're right, Corbyn did fall foul of that, because Brexit, isn't just about the relationship between, the institutions of the United Kingdom, as it's called, and the European Union. It's also about cultural identity and political identity. Yeah. And the left had very few answers to those questions. And look, I'm somebody enormously sympathetic to Corbyn, but you could just see, if he went fully for the Remain side, he would lose large swathes of particularly North England urban working class, English nationalists, whose nationalist discourse had been completely monopolised by UKIP and the far right. But at the same time, if he'd gone completely that side, he would have lost a lot of the more liberal, younger, metropolitan, cosmopolitan electoral bases in the south, in particular around London. And of course, ultimately his failing was yes, you can talk about sabotage from the right-wingist party. Yes, you can talk about negative media coverage. There was a more fundamental problem.
And he failed
my crucial point is this, though. is that if the left wants to succeed, in my opinion, it can't shy away from progressive nationalism. That's something that killed the Irish Labour Party. Yeah. It's one of the reasons why, by the way, most working class people traditionally voted for Fianna Fáil, because under Lemass, from Lemass on, they had a quasi-social democratic, nationalist, urban political party linked to the trade unions in the way the Irish Labour Party could never do. And on that basis, I don't think we're that different from most of the European countries. Some of our delineations are different, but the political dynamics, I think, are broadly similar. We're much more similar to, say, the Catalan dynamics and the Basque dynamics, and a little bit to the Greek and Portuguese than we are to the core Eurozone countries.
Yeah, but it does seem to me, though, that at least in continental Western Europe, or maybe we can begin to move on to talk about Europe and the European Union, maybe it says more about the academic world in these countries, but I think the intellectual leadership in these countries on the left and, generally really struggle with the idea that it's possible to have a progressive left nationalism or a civic, and in my mind, the way I would conceptually distinguish these things is that you can have a civic nationalism and you can have an ethno-nationalism. It's obvious that what's happening in the UK at the moment, in England in particular, it's a deeply held ethno-nationalist view. And we know in the history of this country, there's always been a strong tradition of a nationalist narrative in Britain, and it manifested itself in empire. I think in Ireland, because of the kind of anti-colonial, anti-empire past, which has been articulated by different parties, traditionally Sinn Féin, Fianna Fáil, arguably now most in Sinn Féin, that it does make it a lot easier to combine a kind of left economic story and about social justice and socio-economic rights, whilst simultaneously having no problem waving the flag, because you're fighting a colonial battle and you're a small country and so on. And it just seems to me that, in other countries, when they look at Ireland, they find that unusual. Even the terminology of republicanism, and you've talked about left republicanism. And I think you wrote a really interesting piece a few years ago in the Business Post, was it about Gerry Adams' 1986 book and the idea of left, of what that means. And it is an interesting tradition. But I think amongst the Irish political commentariat, at least, that story isn't being told, but it's clearly a story that's held more widely in Irish society. Are Sinn Féin a Eurosceptic party?
So there's a couple of different questions there, and I just wanted to finish answering your last question, right? Because you asked the question around the 2020 general election here in the South, and I think you're absolutely right. There has been a shift, and you can trace that shift back, for example, to the Lisbon Treaty referendum, because for the first time, large numbers of people who positively identify with the European Union voted against an EU treaty because they didn't want to withdraw from the European Union. They went against the European Union. They didn't like the content of that treaty in terms of what it meant for Ireland and the European Union in social, economic and political institutional terms.
Yeah.
Obviously then the slow demise of the combined Fianna Fáil Fine Gael PD vote from 1989 to 2008 is well charted. But I think what happened after 2008 was those people who were no longer satisfied with supporting centre-right technocratic what I call kind of Europeanist parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, were fragmented. So Sinn Féin got a bit of it, the smaller left groupings got a bit of it, the Soc Dems got a bit of it, etc. What changed in the course of the general election in 2020 was a much larger group of that demographic who wanted change coalesced around a single pole, and that was Sinn Féin. But they also increased their vote for the Greens and for the Social Democrats. So the real significant shift isn't the demise or the reduction of the Fianna Fáil Fine Gael share of the vote. That has been happening. It's the coalescing, and it was one of the big challenges Sinn Féin had previously. We were kind of saying, look, if we're going to form a progressive government here, a left-led or an exclusively progressive left government, somebody has to be the bigger partner of that. Somebody has to coalesce. And I think the one thing we did, which was very significant, and this does positively answer your question around socioeconomic issues, we spent an awful lot more time in the last 12 months talking about the positive solutions to the socioeconomic challenges that people have, whether it's housing need, childcare need, healthcare need, etc. But always putting that in a broader, progressive, nationalist, all-Ireland context, and articulating that through a kind of a populist discursive strategy. Yeah. And I think those are the things that were the recipe for our success. To move on to your subsequent question. So actually, if you look at the history of the European left, when the French Communist Party and the Italian Communist Party were at their height, they were exclusively nationalist parties. In fact, it was their combination of nationalism and the progressive partisan nationalism coming out of the Second World War, and their mobilization and articulation of cultural and national traditions with the institutions of the trade union movement, the party, and the socio-economic demands that made them such powerful forces. If you look at social democratic parties right up until the 1980s, they were broadly nationalist, right? Yeah. So what happens is that social democracy, as it's faced with the challenge of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the discrediting of democratic socialism and communist political parties, and then the increasing hegemony of the neoliberal project across Europe, whether it's the ordoliberalism in Germany or the Thatcherite, more unabashed liberalism in Britain, is the social democratic parties enter a period of crisis. And what a lot of them start to do is embrace a kind of a technocratic liberal cosmopolitanism. That happened with the Irish Labour Party, the British Labour Party. It happened with Felipe González's Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, etc. So it's from that moment that nationalism for the liberal European left becomes a problem. And of course, the commentariat in Ireland are part of that, what I call social liberal consensus. And I use that term very, very generally because it combines a whole range of people.
Yeah.
And there are two reasons why those parties declined electorally. One was economic policy and abandoning the traditional policies which supported their core economic base. But the second was their embrace of technocratic Europeanism and that growing distance then that emerged between working class and lower middle class communities and the institutions of governance. And that's one of the features of Europeanization. Like Peter Maher, for example, his short book around the kind of the hollowing out of the European political space, I think tracks all of that quite well.
Yeah.
So I suppose that the space we're now in is so where does that leave us? And when I wrote the book Sinn Féin and the Politics of Left Republicanism, in the conclusion I made this distinction between cultural nationalism and civic nationalism, right? I don't subscribe to that anymore. I think I was wrong. I'm a cultural nationalist, right? But I'm not an ethno-nationalist, and how I think of Irish culture is in a very plural, diverse way. And just as I think, national identity in a political sense shouldn't be left to the right, nor should cultural identity. So, for example, what do we mean by, cultural identity? Because cultures are porous and they're fluid and they change, absolutely, but they're historical material realities. So Irish culture is the culture of everybody who is from here, who comes here, and who has an origin here. And that thing changes and mutates. Like I used to be a big fan of Planxty, right? And people would think of Planxty as a traditional Irish trad band. Well, one of the great innovations of Planxty was the use of a very un-Irish instrument, the bouzouki, into Irish trad music. Now, every trad band in the country has a bouzouki, but it's, from abroad. If you think of hip-hop bands from the 80s and 90s, like Marksmen, for example, or the Africa Sound System, like that's Irish music, but open up to international influences. And likewise, for example, I've been listening a lot to Lancome. And again, anybody who likes the Silver Mount Zion post-punk kind of droney music can hear those international influences in something that's incredibly Irish.
Yeah.
So actually, my view now is that, like, I'm a Republican in the sense that that's how I would like the institutions of the state to operate, right? So Republican in terms of a kind of a participative notion of democracy and how people get to make decisions. I'm a socialist in terms of how I'd like the economy to run and a particular version of that. I'm a Democrat in the sense that I believe in democracy, but I think we need to go much further than just representative, to have much more participative democracy. But I'm a cultural nationalist in the sense that, what does it mean to be Irish? Well, we are everybody who is here, who is from here, who has come here, who has origins here. And whatever we do culturally, whatever that hybrid mix is who we are. And I think, I always point to a moment in the Catalan independence referendum. I was an observer there as part of an international delegation of people, both supportive of Catalan self-determination and critical of it. We observed it. There was a wonderful moment in the final rally, right? So you had this huge rally run by this civil society campaign. And at the final moment of the rally, this is the night before the vote, different sectors of Catalan society came out and brought onto this huge stage enormous letters, right? Independence equals democracy. And there were school teachers, and there were firefighters, and there were students, and there were, whoever. And there were minority communities who had migrated, communities who had been born of Asian, of African origin, etc. And what the Catalan independence movement was trying to do at that moment is symbolize visually a cultural nationalism that is open, that is plural, that is cosmopolitan. So I suppose that the distinction I now make isn't between a civic nationalism, which is good, and a cultural ethno-nationalism, which is bad, but a cosmopolitan nationalism, which is a essential ingredient, I think, to any democratic project, on the one hand. And on the other, a kind of a liberal cosmopolitanism, which I think is part of our political problem. And on the other side, that very reactionary, ethno-nationalist, xenophobic, racist project. And I think the antidote to both is that cosmopolitan nationalism, which of course for me, you know, is very similar to what Syriza were trying to do in terms of their identity politics. Corbyn was trying to do, Sanders to a less successful extent. You know, that was one of his problems. And I think you're absolutely right. What is the dominant trend among the Irish commentariat? And I say this not in a pejorative way. It's a kind of a social liberalism, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's in favour of European integration. It's in favour of marriage equality and gay rights. You know, it's in favour of greater female participation in the labour force. It doesn't want too much interference, though, in market distribution and market mechanics. And when things get too bad, like the housing and health crisis, it wants something done. But it's not going to go so far to the left. So it sits in the centre, and its economic policy is kind of tilting to the right, and its social policy is kind of tilting to the left. So that social liberalism is pervasive in our commentariat. And I think they have a real difficulty understanding our project, because they set themselves up from the 1980s and 90s in opposition to traditional Catholic conservative nationalism. And they don't have the vocabulary to understand that, yeah, that's a problem and that's there, but you have this other thing. And my final answer to your question is this. You know, why do we not have a large right-wing Eurosceptic, xenophobic, anti-immigrant party? You're looking at the reason.
Yeah.
Right? And I think most honest commentators will say one of the reasons is because we don't just represent a progressive nationalist project, which is left of centre and progressive on issues of migration and social policy. We are active, mobilised on the ground in those communities, which have been abandoned by Fianna Fáil and the Labour Party in the main. But we have filled that vacuum and that void very, very quickly with progressive alternatives. So I live in a constituency with the second largest direct provision centre in the country.
Yeah.
At the height of the Eurozone crisis, when large numbers of my core electorates were without jobs and without homes and unable to get healthcare, I would have had lots of conversations with people who were saying, look, Owen, I'm not against Africans. I understand these people are fleeing war, but should we not look after our own first? Right? My son can't get a job. My daughter can't get a house. And our activism on the ground, and we're not the only people, by the way, some of the other smaller left parties have done exactly the same thing and should be commended for it, is what we did with those conversations is convince people, actually, don't be worrying about the asylum seekers. In fact, they have as much to complain about as you do. Let's all collectively focus our anger on where it should be, the political and economic elites who are leaving your sons and daughters without houses and jobs and forcing asylum applicants to live in the most appalling conditions in the direct provision centre. And by giving progressive leadership on the ground in communities and councils and in the Oireachtas, we fill that space. And that's why it's the Tinfoil Hat Brigade led by Gemma O'Doherty who are trying to get into that, and nobody will take those people seriously.
Yeah, no, I think I think this is really an interesting observation, and I would share your analysis on this, and I think it's backed up by the data. But it seems to me that a mistake that's often made in political science, generally, international political science, is that there's public opinion, people hold views, they have preferences, and those preferences are mobilized by political parties, and there's a kind of matching of the two. If there's anti-immigrant preferences out there, well, that's going to get reflected in a political party. It seems to me that political parties themselves have a very active role to play in mobilizing, strategizing, and showing leadership, quite frankly. And there's no leadership on those questions. If people aren't willing to get down on the ground and have difficult conversations, you know, and debate those issues, then you can be sure that they will get articulated and mobilized. And I think that is an important observation, which is often lost in Western European politics, that ultimately people are racist, the working class are racist, and therefore the right can have them, you know. I think that's a really dangerous way to think, because I don't think that is indeed the case at all. I think actually it depends on the issues, it depends on how you mobilize, it depends on the weighting that you attach to certain things and so on. And in many ways, housing, this is reflected in housing. I mean, you've also wrote an article in the past, I think, on housing and classism, and I think that's very true. It seems to me that the biggest obstacle to solving the housing crisis in Ireland and to generate sufficient popular support for public housing is classism. People don't want what they perceive to be council housing next door to them. And nobody is ever really kind of willing to publicly say that. They would say it privately, etc. But it seems to me that this kind of class divide, and this is important. And conversely, this would require leadership, and I think in many ways you will be willing to make the case. I think you would be willing to argue that you should have council housing next door to you. So I think the same issue has to happen on housing. I don't see too many politicians out there arguing for social housing in the middle of private middle class communities.
So let me I suppose just track back and just make one point about the initial part of what you said. So for example, politics isn't just in supply and demand, because politics is at all times. And what political parties do is as much affected by what they think their target electorates or their core electorates are saying to them, or what is actually being said. There's an ongoing dialogue. And if you're an activist-based party like we are, and like, you know, outside of COVID, I canvass twice a week, every week in my constituency, we're very engaged and we spend a lot of time listening to people. So we've a style of politics which the bigger parties, or the older bigger parties like Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael used to have and don't anymore, is that dialogue is a two-way street. And it's not just two-way, because within parties there can be different priorities, within the electorates there can be different demographics and different interests, and you're negotiating all of that. And you're also talking to NGOs, and you're talking to business groups, and you're talking to trade unions, and so it's much more kind of fluid, if you like, than just a straightforward voters want this, parties offer that, and who matches and who doesn't. And it's also about what doesn't get done. So again, if you take the example of what I was saying in terms of my own constituency and the concerns that people had about the distribution of resources at the height of the Eurozone crisis, and what I said about Bermondsey, for example, in London, and only because I lived there in the early 90s, it's what the Labour Party in Britain didn't do in Bermondsey that caused the problem. They didn't go in and engage with and listen to and service the needs of those working class deindustrializing communities that left the vacuum open for the far right. And that's just important to remember. And again, you know, Peter Mayer's book, I think, is important, because if we're concerned about that hollowing out of the space of democratic politics, then there's only one way you fill it, folks, right? And that's by knocking doors, it's by meeting people in small hallways, hall rooms, it's by walking the streets. Like, we all do focus groups, we all do opinion polls, you know, we all listen to all of the research, and that stuff is really important. What went wrong, I think, with the liberalization of politics and the technocratization of politics in the 80s and 90s, is they replaced the old ways of doing the stuff with the new ways. And I think that's their problem. We have to combine the both. There's nothing better. I tell you this, come and canvass with me any Friday or Saturday. There is nothing better than knocking 100 doors to know what's going on, what people think about you, the government, the country. It is the most direct way to engage with people. And it's really important. So just to say all of that.
Well, can I say something there? Is that the reason why Sinn Féin did not do particularly well at the local elections? Did they forget that? Because it seems to me that, I could be totally wrong on this, but my intuition, my perception on this is that Sinn Féin got punished at the local elections because they were perceived to not be solving local problems.
I think that we had a couple of problems. We had a bad presidential election with very, very bad branding and messaging, which I think caused us a difficulty. So we went into the locals and Europeans down on that. I also think we were having some transition problems. So when you change party leader, it takes a while for you to settle into what's the new kind of emphasis or focus, etc. And I think at the time we were just a bit too cranky and a bit too negative, and you know, we hadn't moved into that, yes, everybody knows there's a housing crisis, but what are you going to do to fix it mode? And I do think in a number of key constituencies, because our local elections were divided into three categories. Constituencies where we held our votes, Waterford, Donegal, Cavan Monaghan, for example, all big strongholds, no problem there. Constituencies where we fell in single digits, and they would have been constituencies where we were organisationally weak on the ground, maybe rural constituencies. The big surprise was the urban constituencies in Dublin, Cork, where we lost half our vote. Yeah. So in my constituency, for example, we went from 24% to 11%. We were decimated, right? And yet we canvassed twice a week. We had a TD who did very well, and the party did very well in 2016, with good local councillors. One of our councillors actually topped the poll in the election. So first of all, understanding those results requires a little bit more depth of analysis. But for example, in Dublin, what did us damage wasn't that we weren't solving local problems, because generally councillors don't get to solve an awful lot of problems because of the limitations of local government. But we were over-reliant on a party brand. And for example, in Mid-West, 3 local electoral areas, we thought we were going to take 5 seats. We thought the independents would take 3, 1 in each. the independents cleaned up because they were clearly seen as prioritising shouting for the local above all else, where we were trying to manage both the local and bigger needs. And I think that did us damage, certainly in those areas. To move on, though, to your central question, however, I don't think the problem is classism. And like that classism is there, right? So, and I've talked about it, and the prejudice towards public housing and local authority housing is a fact. But there's a misconception out there that, for example, objections to planning permissions for social housing are one of the reasons why we don't have enough social housing. Hardly any social housing projects get blocked to planning, hardly any. Right? I can think of one in South Dublin in the 10 years I've lived in the constituency, and I can think of one in Dublin City that was delayed. Right? So while politicians will, at a performative level, whinge and complain, they won't block. Right? It's the same plan with this argument that developers tell us that planning is a problem with overall residential construction. Planning is not our problem in our housing system whatsoever. There are issues around planning which we need to fix, but that's not the issue. Right? So I think we have a much, much more fundamental problem than classism or prejudice, or even though those things are there.
Yeah.
Our key problem is a failure of the state since the end of the 1980s to understand that the housing market, in fact, is not a market, but is a system. Yeah. And it is a system in which the private market can only meet the needs of a section, and other actors, non-market actors, have to meet the needs of the rest. And they can be local authorities, they can be state agencies, they can be not-for-profit bodies, they can be community housing trusts, or whatever, right? And as a result of that, we have had a problem from the 1990s to the present that was kind of papered over by the cheap access to easy credit during the Celtic Tiger, but ultimately came back to haunt us, whereby by the state completely withdrawing from anything but the provision of housing for the most needy in our society, very, very low levels of social housing provision, then this other large gap, right? Working class, lower middle class, young professionals, etc., were left at the mercy of the market with a series of different types of crises: rental sector crises, mortgage distress crises, unaffordability crises, etc. And at the same time, the model that the private sector utilised for the delivery of homes became increasingly dysfunctional. So that not only is housing unaffordable, the private sector just cannot today, on the basis of the development model it currently pursues, deliver homes for people to rent or buy, working people like you, for example, at anything close to affordability.
Yeah.
So that's our central problem, and that's been a structural feature of our housing system since the end of the 90s, early 1991. And therefore, we can deal with planning issues and we can deal with prejudice, and councillors who like to whinge and moan about, deflating private house prices by having public housing beside them. That's straightforward enough. Until we have a government that says we need a very, very large non-market intervention. I have my preferences, I've outlined in my book. Other left of centre political parties have other preferences how you do it. And for example, today we need 50% of all new home completions to be non-market completions, whether it's led by local authorities or approved housing bodies or community housing trusts, etc. And to deliver those units either for very low income families subsidised, so that's what we call the differential social rental system, for affordable cost rental, where you're not getting any subsidy, you're just renting at the economic cost of delivering the unit, or affordable leasehold purchase, where you can buy the property at an affordable price, but that it's tied into permanent affordability of that unit if you ever sell it into other people into the future. And only when we get a government that's willing to mobilise investment to deliver units on scale to meet those needs are we going to get the kind of stable housing system that we need. Like, at least 30% of our housing stock should be non-market. It's only 9%. And at least twice the level of capital investment by the state needs to be invested from this budget onwards to meet those needs. And crucially, because there is a debate about whether large mono-tenure public housing estates are good or bad. The empirical evidence actually says that in the most instances, so long as they're properly run, they're very good. This idea that large volumes of public housing in one place with large groups of people with single tenure is a bad thing. It's not borne out by the evidence over 25 years of those policies. But what we do need is income mix. Communities need to be economically viable. They need to be able to sustain shops and businesses and schools and whatever. So large volumes of public housing, integrating social rental, affordable leasehold purchase, in mid-rise, mixed-use, mixed tenure developments. That's the way to go. But that would require such a shift of government policy and government investment
Yeah.
that it's hard to see. The only good news is now is the time to do it.
Yeah.
The borrowing environment, the cost of borrowing, the European environment, the domestic public mood, everything is aligning, right? So the government that doesn't do it now is the government that has every opportunity to do it. And if they choose not to do it, it's because they choose not to do it. And I think they will be severely punished by the electorate in the next election if they don't do so.
Yeah, it seems to me that housing shaped the 2020 election in terms of national issues, and I think it's probably going to shape the success or failure of this incoming government, particularly in the context whereby they can effectively borrow for large-scale capital investments, of which I would consider public infrastructure and public housing to be a crucial component. And I'm just conscious of the time on. I don't want to keep you much longer. We might just finish up very briefly having a quick conversation about Europe and European integration. This is a podcast that's part of the kind of new European political economy. So again, I mentioned earlier on in the podcast whether Sinn Féin were a Eurosceptic party, and my inference from what you said is, well, they're a Euro-critical party, right? They are critical of European integration because it's perceived as has an institutional bias, if you like, towards a neoliberal project and so on. But how do you see the future of European integration, and how do you see not just Sinn Féin but left populism generally and its approach to the future of Europe? Because it seems to me that there is going to be more integration, and that's fairly obvious in terms of how Europe has responded to the COVID crisis, and the debate on what that will look like it will be shaped by national elections ultimately.
Sure. So look, from 72 up till the kind of the early 90s, you could easily describe Sinn Féin as a Eurosceptic party, just like the British Party was, and etc. And since the mid-90s, and I know this because I've been centrally involved in it in various roles, the party has shifted that position to what we call Eurocritical, which is we want to be members of the European Union, but a very different type of European Union than the one that has come into being. And you're right, the institutional architecture, both from the Treaty of Rome, but particularly from the Maastricht Treaty onwards, has a clear, not only institutional, but legal bias enshrined in EU constitutional law or treaty law towards a variety of forms of economic and social liberalism. And that's one of the reasons why we're in the mess that we're in, both in terms of the Eurozone crisis and the decade of austerity afterwards. I think what the Eurocritical left has been good at is challenging those negatives. So I think the Lisbon Treaty was a real turning point, because before the Lisbon Treaty referendum, every referendum neatly divided between, the section of the electorate that was just against the European Union no matter what, and those people who broadly thought the European Union was a good thing, from people who just generally thought it was a good thing to those who were evangelical about it. Where Lisbon shattered that. And Lisbon was the first time we had a debate about what kind of European Union, and is the European Union on offer the right one? And interestingly, large volumes of people, particularly my age group, I was born in 72, who want to be in the European Union, said no to Lisbon because they didn't like its foreign policy defence content, its international trade content, and its lack of democratic accountability content. And the cosmopolitan liberals really struggle with this because they like those binaries. They like, European and anti-European. And we don't fit that, which is why they struggle so much with it. I think what the Eurocritical left has been much poorer at is outlining, so what's our alternative vision? We've all been so busy trying to articulate our vision at a member state level that, we say, for example, well, we'd like to revisit aspects of the Maastricht Treaty. We'd like to revisit aspects of the Stability and Growth Pact and the fiscal rules. We'd like to look at the return of certain powers back to member states. But there's no coherent project to outline what all of those things will be, partly because we are fighting austerity and now we're obviously trying to do other things. So I think we have an opportunity and a challenge in the coming period, which is to start to articulate those things in a much clearer way. Part of the problem, however, is one of the big democratic deficits at the heart of the European Union is with each round of treaty change, you lock in a set of not just procedural rules, but policy preferences into EU treaty law, which requires unanimity to change. And therefore, if you think it's difficult to win 50% plus one in the general election and institute some socioeconomic policy change at a member state level, treaty change by design, and that's one of the great failures of the European Union, why I'm such a critic of it, makes progressive democratic debate, dialogue and change all the more difficult because it requires unanimity. So I think that's a challenge for the Eurocritical left, which I don't think we have risen to yet. And I think it's something we're going to have to do in the coming period. And that's probably one of the reasons why some of the changes that you've seen at the member state level haven't really percolated into the European Parliament level. So while obviously if you have a populist authoritarian right or progressive populist left government, that's reflected in the council, but you haven't seen the dramatic rise in, for example, the authoritarian right in the European Parliament that some people were saying was likely to happen. And you still have an overwhelming majority of, the social liberals, whether they're in the S&D group or the EPP group, but they're broadly the same political platform. So I think that's an area where there's more work required. But I'm pretty busy trying to solve the housing crisis with my colleagues, not just in Sinn Féin, but in the progressive present. So I'll be focusing on that for the medium term.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, Eoin. Thank you very much for your time. I'm sure our listeners will get a lot from this podcast, and hopefully we'll talk to you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.